Trump coming to power and signaling that he's going to reduce or eliminate Ukraine assistance to Ukraine, that's going to embolden Putin. He's going to think my enemy is now weaker. This is a time to go for more, not less.
We have the US presidential elections just a few days away now, with polls neck and neck. We have Russia making gains across the front line in Ukraine at an increasing rate, including with North Korean troops now. We have democracy in countries like Georgia on its last legs. So I just want to hear from you in the very grand scheme of things. How do you see this moment?
You know, you go back 30 years at the end of the Cold War, you had a condition where there was one global superpower, that was the United States. There's one set of ideas that almost the entire world, both elites and populations, were aspiring to, that was democracy. And I would add markets to that too, by the way. And third, you had a commitment to what back then leaders called the liberal international order. Fast forward to today, all three of those things have changed. So one, the United States is no longer the hegemonic power in the world. You have had the rise of powerful states, China first and foremost, but also Russia. Russia in 1991 was a very weak country compared to Russia today. And you have the rise of some middle powers too, including countries like Iran. Second, you now have an ideological division in the world. I think this is very important for people to understand. It's autocrats versus democrats. And the autocratic alliance is China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and some of their surrogates like Hamas and Hezbollah. And the democratic world is the United States, our NATO allies, our democratic allies in Asia, and our partners in countries like, first and foremost, Ukraine, which is on the front line of this fight between autocrats and democrats, but also countries like Israel, one of the only democracies in the Middle East. And then third, we've had the breakdown of that liberal international order. We don't have agreement about what those rules are, and when they're violated, as they were most grotesquely and in the most audacious way since World War I in Ukraine in 2022, well, I would go back to 2014 first, annexation then, but then greater annexation or attempted annexation after Putin and Russia invaded Ukraine. The international system didn't respond to say, to adhere to the rules of the game. Most countries voted against that, but a lot of them stood on the sidelines. They were neutral, countries like China. And that just suggests to me that we no longer have a unified consensus about what is the international rules of the game.
Hi, my name is Francis Farrell, a reporter here at the Kyiv Independent. On the eve of the most consequential US presidential elections this century, with Russian forces advancing all across the front line, and with a winter coming that might be the toughest in the history of independent Ukraine, we here at the Kyiv Independent are not stopping for a second to bring you what you need to know about this war and about the world processes that affect it. But we need your help. For as little as the price of a cup of coffee, you can join our community of thousands of members who form the core of what makes our work here in Ukraine and across the world possible. To support independent journalism and join us in this fight, become a member now by clicking here. Thank you. If we try and imagine America's place in the world in a second Trump presidency, how do you see his rhetoric and where do you think he could possibly be on that spectrum?
Well, first, we got a few days to go here, so I'm still fighting for Vice President Harris to win so that we can avoid having to answer your question in real life, right? This election is not over yet. I am deeply worried about a second Trump presidency, both because of what he might want to do intentionally and because what his signaling of weakness might provoke unintentionally. So let me explain that. First, this rhetoric versus reality. You know, I just think we have to take him at his word. I have colleagues that say, Mike, relax. He won't do any of these crazy things. Number two, he'll have people around him that will stop him from doing these crazy things. But I'm worried about the rhetoric becoming reality for a few reasons that are different from 2016. First, in 2016, President Trump was as surprised as I was that he won the election. He did not plan for it. He had no transition team. And so he relied on the Rolodex of what I would call traditional Republicans to fill his foreign policy team. And they still did some things I radically disagree with. He did have people like Pompeo, Secretary of Defense Mattis, H.R. McMaster, John Bolton, but they were basically, within the kind of establishment national security folks. And they most certainly stopped Trump from doing some of his craziest things that he proposed. Pulling out of NATO being one on the top of that list. And what's going to be different this time around is none of those people are going to be in the Trump administration. He's disparaged all of them. So the crowd that might, push for continuity will not be there. Second, Trump didn't really know how the government ran when he won in 2016. He was doing other things with his career. And so a lot of the inertia of the government with respect to national security issues just kept going, and in good ways. Trump hardly ever talked about supporting democracy or human rights or freedom abroad. That just was not on his agenda. There were people in his government that did. He never did. And as you alluded to, he always supported autocrats, right? He met with Putin, he sent love letters to Kim Jong-un. He rarely met with small d Democrats struggling against autocracies. In fact, off the top of my head, I can't think of a time that he met with opposition leaders from Iran or Belarus or China or Russia. I can't think of a meeting that he ever had. Now his team has figured that out, how it works, and they'll be paying attention and be more in line with what he wants to do. He will feel like he has an electoral mandate to do these crazier things. If he wins again, he'll feel like this is what the American people want. And when it comes to things like NATO or our allies in Asia, he thinks that the American people support him in saying to Putin, do whatever the hell you want. When we signal weakness, when we try to appease dictators, that's when bad things can happen. And so on the borders of Russia, between NATO and Russia, I think the first important thing to remember is that the Soviet Union and Russia have never attacked a NATO ally. Now, here in the United States, there's a group of people that thinks NATO causes conflict. It's exactly the opposite. NATO has been a stabilizer and has provided peace. And there's no doubt on my mind that when Ukraine joins NATO, that will be stabilizing. And Putin knows it, by the way. This myth that he's obsessed with this is completely false. I've been in meetings with Putin. He understands that. But if we're showing that we're no longer credibly committed to NATO because Trump says, I don't really care about these places, then we will tempt Mr. Putin to test our commitment. And I don't think he'll try to roll, full-scale invasion and have his tanks in downtown Tallinn. But I do think he might test, some kind of operation in one of the Baltic states and then pull back and then see what happens. And I think that will trigger a debate within NATO, and that will be highly destabilizing.
How do you see this idea of Trump's claim of being able to bring the war to an end very quickly, if not in 24 hours, but very quickly, by just calling both sides and forcing them to the table? Would Trump really push for peace at all costs, or would he get bored of it after a while if the two sides didn't agree? How do you see that actually playing out?
When I was in the government, that was a long time ago, but I heard so many people say, Putin's a realist, he's just transactional, he's a thug, and they completely dismissed that he had any ideological agenda. I happen to believe that you can be a thug and an ideologue at the same time. There's this guy named Stalin. He was a pretty thuggish guy, but he also had this ideological agenda. And because we poo-pooed that, we didn't see these kinds of transnational networks that Putin has been building and investing in. Now, having said all that, there's good news and bad news with regard to your scenario. The good news should Mr. Trump win and make that phone call is that Putin, because there is this ideological affinity between them, might have an incentive to help Mr. Trump achieve that outcome. Because Putin rightly believes, in my mind, he's calculated rightly, that a successful Donald Trump is in the long-term national interests of Russia as defined by Putin. And so I think there might be an incentive for him to help Trump look good, because that'll help him achieve other objectives down the road. Having said that, I'm on the balance of things, I'm not optimistic that Putin will do that, for a couple of just very elementary reasons. One, rarely do wars end when one side is becoming weaker and the stronger side says, okay, I'm going to stop fighting. That doesn't happen. Usually wars end either one side wins or there's a stalemate on the battlefield. Trump coming to power and signaling that he's going to reduce or eliminate Ukraine assistance to Ukraine, that's going to embolden Putin. He's going to think my enemy is now weaker. This is a time to go for more, not less. The second thing is, remember, to everybody, you know this, Francis, but I'll bet you not everybody remembers, that if you buy a map in Russia today, not only Crimea, but the 4 other regions of Ukraine are now on the Russian map, because Putin, in a paper, an event at the Kremlin, annexed them on paper. But he does not control those territories in reality. And I just don't see a scenario under which he gives those territories up until he's stopped on the battlefield. And some crazy Russians say, well, yeah, we can get a peace agreement just as long as Ukraine withdraws from those territories and gives us those territories, then we'll be happy. You know Ukraine better than I, but my guess is that's not going to happen. So I just think it's a bit of a naive scheme. And then that gets us to what you alluded to rightly. If Trump is rebuffed, would he then change his mind? That's what my Republican colleagues say. I hope that's true. I fear they're wrong. I just fear that Trump fundamentally doesn't care about Ukraine. He fundamentally doesn't care about democracy. He fundamentally doesn't care about the international rules of the game, that annexation is a bad thing. And he still fundamentally does care about his personal relationship with Putin. That's one of the, Trump's been all over the board on issues for many decades. But one thing he's been very consistent on is his support for Putin, his admiration for Putin. That has never, ever wavered.
It's good that you brought up handing over even more territory. Just a reminder, we're talking about the city of Zaporizhia, 700,000 people, the city of Kherson, which was already occupied, another 300,000 people.
You just made a really good point that I want to underscore, at least for people in the United States. You can imagine, given what my job, I'm in countless meetings and talks about, terms of a peace agreement and land for peace. And Americans and Europeans, I don't want to say all, but they almost reflexively, when they say land for peace, they never think about what you just pointed out, which is people for peace. Because those are not just uninhabited places. What we're talking about is handing over Ukrainians, and we know how the Russians are treating them. This is colonization. This is imperialism. This is genocide that we're talking about as part of these swaps. It's just not land. These are human beings that are Ukrainian citizens. So that's why I think, just flippantly saying, oh, no big deal, let's hand this over. No, it is a very big deal. Mr. Trump on the campaign trail says Biden's going to drag us into World War III in Europe. That's one of his main talking points. And it's popular, by the way, because Americans don't want to fight World War III with Russia. And he gets a big applause lines and polls show that's popular. I hope that after the election, President Biden will finally take the right decision to eliminate constraints on the use of long-range fires, because it is not, doing that will not lead to World War III. That's Putin propaganda. And we had this debate about Abrams tanks. We had these about Patriots. Patriots were going to start World War III. Abrams tanks, F-16s. I was involved in every single one of those debates. None of them proved to be true. None of those weapon systems triggered the use of a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. And I hope that President Biden will take that decision so that he doesn't hand that decision to this new president, President Harris, takes it off the table so that it's already a fait accompli. I think that would be very prudent. And the second thing I hope President Biden will do will signal much more clearly our support, America's support, for Ukraine's membership into NATO. Now, maybe he has to, put some qualifications after the war, after hostilities have ended. I would accept that. But I think it just needs to be automatic whenever hostilities end and wherever the borders are. And that's a decision for President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people, not for outside Americans like me. But wherever it is, the same day, not a 2-year process, that is the day that Ukraine should become a member of NATO. And that is the day that you make sure that there's not going to be a third invasion of Ukraine.
Do you think President Harris, once elected, could be willing to change course and do something braver?
The vice president on the campaign trail talks about her 7 meetings with President Zelensky all the time. That, I think, are good signs. What we don't know is what will be the next administration. I was just on a panel with my colleague Condoleezza Rice, a former Secretary of State here at Stanford, and she said, sometimes personnel drives policy. Because Vice President Harris does not have a long list of former advisors like Biden did. Remember, Biden was in the Senate for decades, so he had an army of former national security advisors, and many of them took prominent jobs. One of them is the Secretary of State. The other one's a national security advisor right now. She doesn't have that bench. I think the transition to a new Harris administration might be more like other transitions where you get new people with new ideas. And I hope that those people will be ones that understand the importance of defeating Putin's army in Ukraine.
I would be really interested to hear what you think about the Russian side, having been ambassador in Russia and thinking about if we do take the positive approach that Russia needs to be stopped on the battlefield, what will it actually take for Putin to look at the situation he's got, both at home and on the battlefield, and decide, I can't do it any further? We know from Ukraine, I guess the perspective here is that people are quite skeptical of internal opposition, kind of resistance to the regime having any real effect. What do you think on that side could be the thing that breaks first?
Well, tragically, I don't see a scenario under which domestic politics inside Russia will lead to an end of the war. It's a dictatorship. It's become more autocratic since the war began, or the war escalated. Let me correct myself. Obviously, the leading opposition leader, Navalny, he killed because he was fearful that if he were released in this swap, that would be dangerous to him. And I think he was right about that calculation. I think we just have to admit, and this is an argument I have with Russian opposition leaders all the time, Putin's not fighting this war alone. This is not Putin's war. This is Russia's war. Millions and millions and millions of Russians support this barbarism. They're the ones doing the killing. They're the ones doing the terrorist attacks against Ukrainians. They're the ones kidnapping Ukrainian children. Vladimir Putin is not doing that alone. And tragically, more people support the war today than they did at the beginning of the escalated invasion in 2022. Those are, I think, just tragic facts, but facts. The second thing I would say, therefore, a group of oligarchs is not going to get together and tell them, hey, Vladimir, this war is bad for us. That's not the way it works. They have their money, they have their billions because Putin gave them permission to have them. And in some cases, like the head of Rosneft, Igor Sechin, he literally gave him his company, right? He literally stole it from Khodorkovsky and gave it to his buddy Sechin. So Sechin doesn't have a lot of leverage to say, this is really bad for business. Or the Gazprom guy, Miller. By the way, it's been really bad for business for Gazprom. That company's been completely destroyed because of this idiotic war, but he has no leverage to do that. So I see it as a two-phase thing. One, we just have to help Ukrainian warriors stop or defeat the Russian invading army. It's just that simple. There's no roundabout. We have to give them the means they need and deprive Putin of the means he's acquiring. And by that, I mean dollars through selling oil to places like China and India, but also technology, including American technology, that continues to flow into Russia because we're not enforcing sanctions in the way we should, and we haven't adopted sanctions in the way we should. So I just think there's no other option but that. And tragic as that sounds, I think that is true. And then second, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. And there are lots of instances where defeat in war leads to political change inside countries, including Russia, back in 1917, and even the war in Afghanistan. That war, which dragged on, it played a critical role in undermining support for the Soviet regime. And when Gorbachev came in, he withdrew. And I would just remind people that these are very hard things to predict. I study revolutions, I study democratic change, I teach courses here at Stanford, and what I tell my students is we're just not very good. We social scientists, and I worked 5 years in the government, I would say the CIA as well, we're not very good at predicting these events, but one of the triggers of political change inside countries are defeats in war. So I think to the Russian opposition, if you're listening, you don't have very many effective means to do things inside Russia. The best thing that could happen for you is for Putin to lose this war. And so I would encourage you to speak more loudly about helping Ukrainians and their supporters in the West to achieve that fact.